welcome to Varn Blog. And today we're talking with Ben Burgis, author of Give Them an Argument, Left to the Left, and Counseling Comedians While the World Burns, both for $0. And you have other books that'll come out eventually. I don't know if you can talk about them yet, but I know they're in the
yeah, sure. So I'm under contract for two. So one of them that is very early stages is for Verso. It's like a feasible socialism book with Bhaskar Sankara and Mike Beggs, and the other, which is solo and is for Zero, which I've actually been working a lot on in the last couple of weeks, is the Christopher Hitchens one.
So which I'm sure will stir up a lot of controversy. I think the last left engagement with Hitch was probably Unhinged by
Seymour,
Richard Seymour.
Yeah, right. And I mean, part of the reason that I'm doing this is that I think, even though I probably agree with like 75% of what Seymour says, I guess I'll just go ahead and talk some shit. I think, it's really struck me more and more, especially the year since I read it, as a pretty one-dimensional condemnation. And I think that there's interesting stuff there that, that deserves a more nuanced treatment. Like I think that even the new atheism, Seymour's got I think a pretty typical, left take on it, which is basically that the whole thing's just like a front for, post 9/11 Islamophobia. But I mean, as you find out in passing, even in Seymour, Hitchens was basically a new atheist in 1982, when, examples about Islam might get mentioned, but they certainly weren't the, focus. I definitely, I'm definitely not a, I don't like my atheism with a capital A. But and I think there's a lot of really reductive and really unmaterialist history going on with that side of Hitchens, but also I don't know. I mean, I think that I think that you should evaluate it on the merits and not just sort of it's okay, this is something I remember hearing about in the Bush era, so it's that, and that's that.
Yeah, well, maybe this is a digression, but I've always thought that the whole category of new atheism lumps together a bunch of different kinds of atheists. Because Dan Dennett, if you think about the Four Horsemen, Dan Dennett doesn't seem to fit. He doesn't have any of the political things you can associate with Dawkins or Harris or Hitch, and there's even between Dawkins, Harris, and Hitch, their stances towards the war vary greatly. Their stances towards Israel vary greatly. I think people would be surprised to know that Hitchens wasn't a Zionist, even as late as 2009. So, I'm not here to totally rehabilitate Hitchens' criteria nature, but I do think it needs to be engaged with better than it has been, and also people dealing with what would have been attractive about that needs to be handled better than sometimes you just hear trot to neocon pipeline or something like that, which is
I also think that's wildly exaggerated. I mean, I think that lots of people who are radicals, I think that there are plenty of examples of radicals who end up as conservatives, and it's possible. I haven't seen anybody try to crunch the numbers, but it's plausible that it's disproportionate among Trotskyists just because there's so many fewer of them to start with. But come on. I mean, what people always sort of construct this narrative with Hitchens, and
Hitchens, Shachtman, James Burnham, and maybe the older Crystal.
Yeah. And of course, and I think that Shachtman basically doesn't fit at all. He sort of aged into a pretty mediocre moderate social democrat. But the way that people talk about Shachtman, you'd think that Shachtman had the same positions as Burnham. He just didn't. And Burnham, yeah, I mean, he was a trot, and then he was like a flaming conservative like 6 months later, and like while Trotsky was still alive. And yeah, I mean, like I think there are a couple of real examples, but also like I think there are few enough real examples that I'll see people end up talking about like Paul Wolfowitz, who was like never anything like a trot, but like had some like family connections with people who were maybe.
Right.
And it's pretty.
I've heard David Horowitz mention, and he was a Maoist. Like,
right, exactly. Like this is something I think is, for whatever reason, like this is just like a meme that's like really that's become incredibly popular on the left. That like, oh, there's some, you're sort of explaining how somebody became a neocon by the fact that they started as a trot, and trots are annoying. There's lots of bad things you can say about them, but I think you got to give them a pass on the idea that there's something innate about Trotskyism that's more that's more susceptible to people becoming neocons, especially because like Hitchens, okay, he was a trot for like a few years in the 1970s.
So was his brother. I mean, that's the other thing. Like, he's the same time Peter Hitchens, who in many ways is the polar mirror opposite of Christopher, was also a trot in the same time period in the same party. I mean, like, so I don't know what you can deduce from that.
Yeah, right. You could be a trot of the 70s in Britain and become Christopher, or you could become Peter, or you could become like just like any number of Blairites. Like that's not like that. That mostly just tells me that most people who are attracted to radical politics at a time when it was having something of a moment in the sun don't stick with it, and they end up as something else. But what the something else is, just varies. Varies wildly, and I think that's also one of the reasons that that the idea of writing about this was appealing to me, because I think that so often on the left, our whole like any time that we try to engage with people who used to be on our team and then aren't anymore, like the only analysis we're really willing to entertain is that like they're like a sellout grifter or just like random evil or racism or things like that, and it's that doesn't strike me as very useful. I think that there's stuff you can learn from thinking about how somebody who shares a lot of your goals might end up in like unsavory places, like defending the Iraq War, not because somebody not because like they're just a bad person or they were bribed or something, but because there's like they evolved politically in ways that you can think about and learn something from engaging with.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thing to talk about. Have you ever read Daniel Oppenheimer's book Edge It Right, which goes to I got a lot out of that book actually, about why certain people make that turn. There's not a whole lot written about people like me who come from the opposite direction, but I think we're kind of even rarer. So
yeah, I think that's probably right. Like, I think even though, I mean, it's like very rare. I mean, yeah, I guess some people are red diaper babies, but like it's relatively rare that people start out as radical leftists. I mean, everybody, like starts as something else. But I think it's probably relatively rare that anybody is like a intellectual conservative, and then they become a leftist. I mean, honestly, off the top of my head, I can only really think of three examples, which are you, Matthew Sitman from the Commonweal and Know Your Enemy, and Doug Henwood was like, I mean, I don't know.
He talks about his year or two as a reactionary.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think he was like I think it was probably a much shorter engagement, but he was like, I think he was like some kind of like, involved in like organized reactionary student politics or something, way back in the day.
I want to sit down with Matthew Sitman one time because I listened to his podcast, and I do often find that he talks about things that I'm like, yeah, I'm the only other person who ever thinks about that weird shit on the left, about like strange tendencies in Catholic conservatism and how they ended up where they were, and the actual divisions among right wingers, which leftists tend not to know or understand. Which,
yeah, I mean, with a lot
good.
of people on the left are very committed to not thinking that there are any differences between different kinds of right wingers. Like, you know, like there's sort of like, yeah, I mean, you know, like people, you know, libertarians, fascists, Catholic integralists, you know, just sort of like culture war, manosphere people, whatever. It's like all basically the same thing because they're wrong.
Yeah. Which is fair. I mean, the right
sure, I mean, they're all
that
wrong,
way
but they're
too.
not really the same thing.
Yeah, sometimes they're wrong in radically different ways, and often the sociology is actually quite fascinating. The way that they interact with the outside is more unified than leftists tend to interact with outsiders, but internally they're probably actually even more divisive than we are.
Yeah.
I know leftists have a hard time believing that, but
I think that's actually totally right.
So real quick, I wanted to talk to you about you have this part of your book that I mentioned that is often glossed over at the end of interviews, and it is the part where you talk about how cancel culture is not a left-wing phenomenon, and it's not even just a political phenomenon. Would you like to go into a little bit what you mean by that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is in some sense, this is my fault because I think the title that I picked, which certainly expressed the intense frustration that motivated writing the book, has the word canceling in it, and so I think that leads some people to expect, even though the subtitle's a critique of the contemporary left, that it's the book is going to be primarily a deep dive on the general phenomenon of cancel culture, which it isn't. It's I'm concerned about the ways that the left screws up and gets in its own way, and so part of that it has to do with some of the reasons why I think the left is particularly vulnerable to these kind of cancel trends in the larger culture. But yeah, they are cancel trends in the larger culture. So I mean, this is something that I talk about a little bit in the book. I talk about more in a couple articles that I wrote for Jacobin. The main one is So You're Still Being Publicly Shamed, which is a kind of 5 years later retrospective on John Ronson's book, So You're Being Publicly Shamed. And my take on cancel culture is that it's a disease of neoliberalism, by which I mean I think it's something that comes from, it's not monocausal. If it were, it probably wouldn't be as much of a problem. But it broadly comes through a few different routes from these broader social trends that I think have to do with what we on the left tend to call neoliberalism, roughly having like a more reversion to a much more laissez-faire and less social democratic way of managing capitalism. So some of those routes include just the decline of associational culture in general in societies like the United States and many others, but I think you have to be a little careful about that because it doesn't play out quite the same way everywhere. So this is obviously something that sociologists have been talking about forever, bowling alone. But in general, we live in a much more atomized society than we did, just a few decades ago. That some of that is because of financial pressures. That you don't have families where one person can work one 9-to-5 job and support and support a family in the way that they used to, and I think it's certainly exacerbated by the rise of the gig economy, and all of which means that we have a society where people are very disconnected from each other and often feel most connected to each other online, which is not I think, the whole of the issue, but I think is where a lot of this stuff plays out. Combine that with the fact that everybody, that when people are on social media, these are on platforms that are owned by for-profit corporations that have an incentive to make their product as addictive as at all possible. And a lot of the way that they do that has to do with feedback loops that I think really incentivize our worst impulses. So one of the lines that I like the best in that John Ronson book that I mentioned is one where he compares this to the your speed signs that will, the electronic sign that'll show you what the speed limit is and how fast you're driving. And in principle, it doesn't really seem like that should do anything to slow anybody down, because there's no enforcement mechanism attached to it. The sign can't give you a ticket in any way, and it doesn't give you any new information. Every single car comes with a speedometer that tells you how fast you're driving, and like a regular old-fashioned low-tech speed sign tells you what the speed limit is. But there's something about having the two next to each other so you can watch your speed slow down and converge with the speed limit that gives you that little instant reinforcement that actually does, according, given this, what we know from studies that have been done on this, it actually does seem to reduce people's speed and reduce the number of accidents that happen, which is great. But I think the feedback loops that are built into social media tend to reward hair trigger judgments and extreme reactions, because that's what, if you throw the first stone, you get that little endorphin rush of likes and retweets and all that stuff. So the example I always think of is from last year when Wendell Potter, was a former health insurance executive who had a come to Jesus moment about his role in the industry, and has spent like the last 10 years or something fighting for single payer. And he tweeted something about, the lies he used to tell as a health insurance executive. And somebody was, I think they were like a Marvel writer or somebody like that, quote tweeted and said, "Oh my God, this fucking piece of shit actually admitted it." And it got like 75,000, likes and retweets by the time enough people told him who Wendell Potter was, that he took it down. And the thing that always got me about this is it would have taken 3 seconds to just click Wendell Potter's name on the top of the tweet and see his bio which has the word single payer all over it. And the point is not that this guy who tweeted this is a bad guy. It's that I think that the feedback loops that are built into social media tend to disincentivize people from doing it, right? Why do it, right? Why take 10 seconds to do that when you might be missing out on that reinforcement, from throwing that first stone, as Homer Simpson says, but I'm mad now. So I think that's one of them. I think also an exacerbating factor for a lot of this stuff, especially if one of the reasons we're concerned about cancel culture is that oftentimes it manifests in and leads to, and maybe even the goal of people engaged in pile-ons is to get people fired or deplatformed. That the labor movement has been declining for several decades, and the vast majority of American workers work in workplaces that are at will. You can be fired, without, it's not like it's like in Goodfellas, if you're not a made man where you need a sit down and a good reason, to whack you, you can just be whacked over anything, whatever, it doesn't matter. And so I think all of these, and we could get into other stuff, but I mean, I think those are a good start. All of these are ways that I think, because of the general nature of our society that we live in and the way that it manifests, especially online, the trends that we tend to think of when we use that phrase cancel culture, or the sort of the 2017 term, which I kind of liked better in some ways, was call out culture, but whatever, I'm not going to fight about the words. I think that this is stuff that is, because I think it's a disease of neoliberalism, it infects the entire political spectrum. So like in the John Ronson book, one of the most striking anecdotes in there is about this girl named Lindsay Stone, who worked for an organization called Life, worked with people with learning disabilities. very popular with the students, very popular with the parents, seems to be very good at her job. But she and her friend Jamie, while they're on their off hours, they would often take like jokey pictures themselves, post it. The book was written in 2015. This is a couple of years earlier. Post them to Facebook, where like 20 people would interact with them, and stuff like smoking in front of a non-smoking sign. And one of these was at Arlington National Cemetery, where they were on, for a field trip. They were in DC for a field trip for life. They were on their off hours, where there's the silence and respect sign, and Jamie takes a picture of Lindsay, sort of go, right, like this, like joking that she's like yelling and, giving a finger next to the silence and respect sign. And somehow, they weren't careful enough about their privacy settings. It got out and went viral. And there was a massive cancel mob made up of right-wing patriotic militarists who were outraged and calling Lindsay a fat feminist who should go to hell, shouldn't be allowed in the United States. There was a Fire Lindsay Stone Facebook group, with like 10,000 members, immediately, and she did get fired, and it really wrecked her life for a long time. That she took a long time to get a new job. She had, she wasn't really sleeping normally. She wouldn't even go out on dates because she was sure that the guys would Google her and this would be the first thing that they would see. And this seems like exactly the kind of thing that people are typically talking about, when they talk about cancel culture. And I don't, obvious. I think in the last like 6 months, the partisan, like the way that term has been sucked into sort of day-to-day, red versus blue bullshit has gotten really weird. Like lots of stuff that has absolutely nothing to do with canceling is referred to as cancel culture. But like when people are normally talking about, if you think about stuff like what was being complained about in the Harper's letter and things like that, that's it, right? Or it's easy to find like 100 examples from the primary last year of centrists, doing this stuff. Somebody I follow on Twitter, it's at Kayvon, who's a Iranian graduate student, or was a graduate student at that point at Georgetown, and he was a lefty, and he would spend a lot of time fighting with Elizabeth Warren supporters, and there's a point where bunches of Warren supporters were like mass tagging Georgetown to try to get him fired because of things that he'd said in these arguments. So I think it's pervasive. I mean, it's something that everybody does because these are just I think that nobody is immune from these trends. I mean, I'm worried about the left specifically because I'm a leftist. I want us to win. There are reasons that I worry that because of our own internally generated pathologies, we're particularly vulnerable to this stuff. And I think it's counter solidaristic, and there are reasons for us to try to resist it as much as at all possible. Although the most pessimistic part of all this is I don't know how much it's possible. But it's certainly not unique to the left. I mean, that's what I was really trying to push back against, especially that Jacobin article, the sort of view that you often get in the sort of, I don't know, that kind of IDW Quillette kind of corner of the ideological spectrum, or like Jonathan Chait, right? Like I remember the second, the most recent Jacobin thing I wrote about this, we can't cancel our way to a better world. He was tweeting about that article, and he was objecting to it, basically because he wants to blame like Marxism for cancel culture by making this sort of lazy, hazy connection between like the crimes of Stalinism and people denouncing each other, on Twitter in 2021, which I think is exactly the sort of bullshit that leads a lot of people on the left to be like, yeah, we're just going to deny that this thing exists. I think that the healthier response is to say, no, I mean, the thing clearly exists. It's just not a product of the left. It's a product of factors that are vastly bigger than us.
I think about I was listening to, I think it was The Scathing Atheist, just one of those random atheist podcasts, and they were talking about how evangelicals effectively actually kind of invented the tactics that we now associate with cancel culture. But then they did this weird twist where they said that the tactics weren't a problem. Actually, social shaming and limiting platforming was a function of a healthy society to limit the rounds of discourse. And that the reason why the evangelical, shaming became a laughing stock over time and people don't take it seriously, it doesn't really get people fired anymore, was because their values, not the tactic. And I found that was a weird lesson to take from the history they were expounding.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a parallel, between like things that evangelicals have always done, and stuff that has gotten like just super common in the culture at large here. I mean, like this is, I mean, a lot of, in fact, this is kind of what Mark Fisher was, some of what he was saying. It's a comparison he explicitly makes in the Vampire's Castle essay in 2013, which is roughly about cancel culture as it plays out, on the socialist left. And he compares it to Christianity, and I think that they're, yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, like that this sort of like taking a lot of interest in what other members of your church are doing, and going and going after them, and condemning them, for various minor deviations and stuff. That's certainly like, yeah, I mean, there is a sense in which just crudely like, yeah, sometimes like there are days when all of Twitter feels like a great big mega church. And I think that there is there is some analogy there. I do think that that some of this is a little bit different from what evangelicals were doing then. For one thing, I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm going to get myself in trouble here because I don't. Maybe we'll reveal as I go on that I don't know enough about evangelical culture. But I think that I suspect that in a lot of cases, even though evangelical churches don't have that sort of, it's not like Roman Catholicism or even Anglicanism, in terms of hierarchy, that you still probably got more hierarchy in some instances. Like there are clearly defined authority figures, who are in a position to say that Susan is no longer welcome here because she's disgraced herself and whatever. And whereas I think contemporary online cancel culture is vastly more decentralized and crowdsourced. I'd also note, by the way, that this is something I do talk about a little bit in the book, that that in the Vampire Castle essay, Fisher, actually says at one point, probably the most like provocative thing he says in that essay, that actually this stuff is worse than Christianity. And I spent some time thinking about what that could possibly mean, because there's a sense in which that's just obviously wrong. Like, if you think about the terrible things that have been done, let's at least be neutral about causation and say in the name of Christianity, then it's a really long list, right? There's the Spanish Inquisition, there's gay conversion therapy, there's a lot of really bad stuff that's been tremendously harmful in human terms, and nothing that Fisher is talking about, as bad as it is comparable. But I think there's a sense, depending on how you read what he's saying, in which it's defensible, which is just that, like, as a value system, that at least whatever you want to say about Christianity, there's at least the pretense to hating the sin but loving the sinner, and there's a belief in forgiveness and redemption, at least as possibilities. Whereas oftentimes with the kind of moralism that's so culturally pervasive in 2021, I don't know. I often get the sense that that stuff is not really in the cards, right? I mean, like when you spend a lot of time saying that people are literally trash, like that doesn't really seem like you're even pretending to love the sinner. And it does seem like there are a lot of instances where people will profusely apologize for things, and they still get regularly piled on, lose various positions, because of it, like every few years when it's rediscovered. And it does strike me like, Elizabeth Brunig, who actually is a Christian, had a good line about this a while back, about how it really seems like there's just no conception of getting a second shot at some of this stuff, that like it really is on the level of moral idiocy of like, well, if you didn't want this to be held against you forever, you just shouldn't have done it.
That brings me to another book. Actually, you mentioned Richard Seymour earlier. He also wrote a book on a similar topic, but much more pinpointing Twitter, called The Twittering Machine, that talks about the way that he thought that some of that call-out culture could have been useful for dealing with like the real and very pernicious sex scandals in the SWP UK, the Socialist Workers' Party in the United Kingdom, for those who don't know my shorthand. But that, one, it turned on him really fast. I mean, people will forget. He said something offhanded about racialized porn that was not particularly, like, I had to struggle to see why people took such offense to it. Actually, it was kind of weird. And it didn't end him in any way, but it sort of pushed him in a different direction. And I think of another figure, and I'm not going to ask you to slander your people you might end up working with, but I think about the figure of Sam Criss, who also was canceled, admitted what he was accused of was more or less true. It didn't end his career, though. It seems to just pushed him towards a certain more rightwards part of social democrats, of the social democratic spectrum, and that led me to think about a couple of things. One, Chris had led an attack on Mark Fisher during the Vampire Castle essay. I published his attack, actually, when I published the essay that we've been referring to. But two, there's a way in which if you're a certain amount of brazen, or you're willing to change who you associate with, counseling doesn't work.
Yeah, I think for sure it doesn't work in that sense. I mean, this is one of the, in fact, perversely, I think the fact that it doesn't really work is often used as defense. People will say, well, I mean, nobody's really canceled. I mean, who's been hurt that much by this? And oftentimes the very same people will talk about how it's important, that like actually, what you're calling cancel culture is accountability culture, which is a good thing. It's like, well, you kind of can't have it both ways. It can't be that, these are consequences and accountability and, and people not getting away with things anymore. And also that no one's really canceled, and come on, who's really been hurt by this. And it, I think that it works in the sense of delivering various degrees of short-term pain to individuals at various times, although also in a very capricious way in terms of who gets hit by it, who doesn't, and what the standards are. But yeah, I mean, long term, oftentimes, you can get through it, and it doesn't. I mean, unless you want to count people who like really did literally criminal things, and people started talking about it a lot. In the culture and, on Twitter and all that stuff. And then they actually did get prosecuted. Unless you want to count those people, then yeah, there's no, there's certainly no guarantee that it's going to work in the way that it would have to in order to be some sort of tool of accountability and justice for oppressed people. But oftentimes I think that one thing it does work in doing is just permanently severing people's connection to whatever camp they were originally part of. And this is something I've heard you talk about, and I think it's definitely a real phenomenon, which is that you get these kind of feedback spirals where if, and not that, as we've been talking about, not that this is by any means unique to the left, but somebody is excommunicated from the left for kind of nonsensical reasons, and then they end up hanging out with whoever will still have them. And then, of course, human beings being what they are, over time, little by little, they're going to start being influenced by whoever they're still talking to and associating with, and whoever is still willing to associate with them. And then they actually do move to the right. And in fact, one of the things that I find maddening about this a lot of times is that people, will, and I'm not being diplomatic, I really do like barely remember the Chris thing. I mean, I kind of remember like the original, the inciting incident, like reading a little bit about that at the time. I haven't really followed his subsequent stuff too much, but like oftentimes I will see people say like, oh, such and such is moving to the right, or there are telltale symptoms that they're going to move to the right. And, sometimes it's true and sometimes it's not. But what often drives me crazy about this is that if that were really true, then what you're implying that, oh, therefore we should excommunicate them, we should have nothing to do with them because I can tell they're going to start moving to the right, would be the most counterproductive thing that you could possibly do. Because if there's one thing that's guaranteed, at least going to make it much more likely that they're going to move in a direction that you don't like, it's having people who have the views you think they're about to move away from no longer have anything to do with them.
I have to think about a couple of things when I think about this problem. And one of the things that comes up to me, I've thought a lot about recently, is the way that certain people like Philip Weiss or Norman Finkelstein, who I have thought have always had some views that were not particularly left-wing and some views that were very left-wing in the case of Philip Weiss and Norman Finkelstein. But as Dershowitz was able to, and I can mention a specific name here, Dershowitz and the campaigns were able to get them systematically disbanded from their funding charges. They ended up taking money from more and more questionable sources, the biggest and most damning one being Ron Unz, who also funds far-rightist on the Israel-Palestine question, including, people that are undeniably anti-Semites and Holocaust deniers. And Finkelstein and Wise took the money. It's on the record. It's known. I often wonder why, because there's still leftists willing to go to bat for Philip Wise and Norman Finkelstein all the time. But why did we not support our own there? Because I do think it's actually affected their politics. Their talking points sound more right-wing now than they did 5-6 years ago, even though they've always been free speech absolutists, and Finkelstein's always wanted to get hackles up about gender issues, etc. But like, it's a weird thing to watch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. I mean, it's a it's a depressing thing to watch. And I don't, I mean, like, and again, some of these cases, like it's true, right? Like it actually is true that somebody, might be moving to the right, or even just moving in like just a more eccentric direction because, they don't have, like, there's just a different way in which your thoughts would develop if you have people who share a lot of your starting points, who you're interacting with in normal ways as you're thinking and developing on those issues. And if that's no longer the case, right? I mean, it's very likely you're going to develop in some strange directions. And I guess, I don't know, it's very hard to say this without sounding like too kumbaya-ish or I don't know, like too much like a, I don't know, socialist Ezra Klein or whatever. But I think I just think that we would like gain a lot from this stuff if we found a way on the left to detach ourselves from this fixation on the moral character of individuals, right? I mean, like does, I don't know. I mean, I think so. Yeah. I mean, if Norman Finkelstein says some goofy things on some subjects, then I think that he should, he should certainly be criticized for saying them. But I mean, like that just strikes me as a different thing from from like just coming up with an overall evaluation of who Norman Finkelstein is as a person. I mean, like, I guess we keep going back to the religious stuff in this conversation, but I always think of one of the times Adolf Reed was interviewed on TNBS, and he had this great line about how this is just too Protestant a way of doing politics. It just seems to be all about who's going to heaven and who's going to hell, and ideally that just shouldn't be the point.
There is another aspect to this, I think, that does have to be somewhat dealt with, and that is the kind of self-reifying rush of alienated and legitimately oppressed people, and getting their moral panics out. And I'm going to say this advisedly. Someone's calling Norman Finkelstein a Holocaust denier in the chat, which I'm going to smack him for. So
yeah, I'm pretty sure whatever you could say about Norman Finkelstein, positive or negative, I'm pretty sure he knows the Holocaust happened.
But he has worked with people who are Holocaust deniers, and I think that's this thing where, like, there is a implicit guilt by association with no gradations taken by some people. But if I flip the logic around, and I'm done on people before, it's highly selective. So, for example, my things is I always hear about, dirtbaggers or post-leftists. Post-leftists, I think, are right-wingers for the most part. Not all of them, but most of them. And dirtbag leftists, because they use some of the things, get all lumped in with them. I start to wonder about, like, why are people so soft on, I don't know, historical Marxist Leninists who made explicit forays with right wingers, are like when Black nationalist groups actually actively worked with the Klan. I never hear about this in these moral panics, and when I do, it's usually brought up by rightists who just want to go too croquet and dismiss the whole thing. What do you think the psychological function is for that?
Yeah, I mean, I should also say, just for anybody who's not familiar with the guy's backstory, quite a bit of Norman Finkelstein's extended family was wiped out in the Holocaust, which is why I say that I'm pretty sure he knows that it happened. But yeah, I mean, I do think it's incredibly selective. I think that even if you look at stuff like contemporary examples, like people, like some figures, like Black progressive figures who have worked with, or even have like something of a mentor protege relationship with Louis Farrakhan, who even if they now reject many of his views, who are sort of asked to denounce him and won't do it. I think a lot of people on the left have, what, to be clear, I think is probably the right response to that, which is to sort of roll their eyes at the guilt by association and say that it doesn't matter very much, right? I mean, Louis Farrakhan is a marginal figure. He's not really that much of a threat to anything. He certainly has some disgusting reactionary views that should be criticized, but I also don't lose a lot of sleep over who has and hasn't denounced him. But then they don't apply that in many other cases, where there are other kinds of reactionary figures who people might have some 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, or whatever, maybe even 1 or 2 degrees connection to. And I think that some of this, I mean, I guess actually that example maybe even gets us back to your first point about the fact that oftentimes this stuff becomes a proxy for very legitimate complaints that are harder to do anything about. So, I mean, when we were going through all of the ways in which I think cancel culture arises out of the kind of toxic waters of neoliberalism, and this really intensely alienated, late capitalist hellscape, um, which is a very optimistic term, I know, but that's why I use it. I think one that we didn't really talk about was just the fact that we live in a society where lots of people correctly feel really powerless, like that they just don't have any influence over a lot of the things that influence their lives and that cause them grief and hardship. And man, if you can at least get somebody fired, one of the things that does for you is that it makes you feel like you have some power over something. And when you don't feel like you have much power over anything, that's not nothing. And so I think this is a big problem in general for. I'm almost hesitant to say the left here because I don't think I really mean like what we normally mean when we talk about the left, but I think it's a big problem for, let's just say, broadly positive and progressive political energy in our culture in general, that oftentimes it gets channeled into weird and sometimes destructive symbolic nonsense, just because that's the path of least resistance. Last summer, when the country was convulsed with like really an unprecedented scale of protests and riots after the murder of George Floyd, like there's all this energy about police violence and about racial disparities, and it needs to go somewhere. And some of it did go to good stuff. I mean, there were like, some real reforms that happened, especially on a local level in some places, although, not that much relative to the scale of the problem. But a lot of it ended up going to, creating a lot of new jobs for a certain kind of HR flack. A lot of it went to that. And a lot of it went to sort of purely like just the most vacuous kind of symbolism that, you just have all kinds of organizations where there are people who wanted to do something, but it's like the Bruce Schneier security syllogism, something must be done. We have done something, right? We've succeeded. So like, I don't know, the, stuff that that it would be on my radar, like academic, like philosophy, kinds of groups that'd be like, okay, what can we do? What can we do? We can change the names of the prizes, maybe, to be more inclusive. Or like my mom got really into birding and in her retirement, and I remember her telling me last summer that there was a move to change the name of like some kind of warbler that was named after somebody in the Confederate Army. And it just a lot of this just strikes me as stuff that happens because actually changing the way that policing works in America would be an incredibly heavy political lift. It's incredibly difficult to actually make that happen. Never mind the sort of underlying racial disparities in the distribution of poverty that are, the base of a lot of these issues. And whereas, getting somebody fired or doing a training or changing the name of a bird or changing the name of the prizes, all of this stuff is incredibly easy. And I think that that's one of the reasons why a lot of energy that comes from genuine oppression and suffering ends up being channeled in this like weird moralistic policing of individual behavior, because individuals are easy to go after. It's, structures are hard to change.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that the other day. I was talking to an anarchist friend of mine on an interview yesterday, and it'll come out in probably a few weeks, but it's audio only interview. But we were talking about how in some spheres of radical circles, when you talk about police and prison abolition, which I actually support the more radical forms of police and prison abolition. I do sometimes with the caveat that like it requires such a total change of society. You aren't really dealing with capitalism anymore. But whatever. I'll still like sectionally. I'm not going to use that to shit on people who are working on it sectionally, right?
Yeah.
Like there are some left comms who do that to shut people out. But I do notice that some of them actually massively end up increasing the what they would functionally do would increase the amount of community-based death sentences.
Uh-huh.
And I'm not being facetious. Like we were walking through what they were advocating, and I'm like, so you are replacing a really cruel, inhuman, and stupid form of carceral punishment with proceduralist capital punishment. That doesn't seem like a progressive step, but it's because it's easier to imagine, I think, than actually looking at what it would take to really start over ground zero on how to do like community regulation and deal with things like violent instances in your community, right? And I think similarly with a lot of these cultural problems, we tend to think platforming is something we could do, and deplatforming is something we could do, and that's easy. We don't imagine that an entire ecosphere could be built around it, because that's one other thing that I've been thinking about lately. Like canceling someone on Twitter, it's become a rap beef strategy for expanding your market. Literally, that's how it works now. I mean, like, you know, certain areas of things like Substacks, which I don't have a problem with, but they actively kind of encourage this, like to just get people pissed off at you online because it increases engagement, and any talking about you, regardless if it's bad, will help you. So this strategy can only, what I worry about is this strategy can only really, really hurt the less powerful members who get hit by it. Like,
yeah, for sure. I mean, if you have like, yeah, I mean, if you're just like a reporter for one of the 5 local papers that are left in the United States, then you could absolutely just lose your job, and then like that'll be it, right? You know, that like you just have to find something else to to do with your life. Whereas if you're a media figure that anybody's ever heard of, you are likely to, you might suffer like real harms of various kinds that I don't want to be too dismissive of, because I think that they're like, I think that just sort of having like Matt, even the psychological part, like mass denunciation is something that that human brains just aren't really built to shrug off, and I think everybody kind of acknowledges that when they're being honest. Like like a lot of like cancel culture doesn't exist. People still believe that like when people they like are being canceled, it's like they'll come up with other terms for that. It's targeted harassment. They acknowledge that there is something harmful about that, and so I think reputational harm, maybe even financial harms, that like, and just because and I don't want to, I think we do probably overstate the, they'll be totally fine thing a little bit, like, not just in political context, but with regard to like musicians and other people like that. Like, one thing to keep in mind, especially in 2021, is that just because you've heard of someone doesn't mean that they have like a pool of gold coins like Scrooge McDuck. Like that there are lots of people you've heard of, but aren't actually doing.
You can be internet famous and make less than $40K a year.
Like, yeah, exactly, right. But I think that that said, if somebody's a media figure you've actually heard of, yeah, more than likely, like especially if they're willing to be a little opportunistic about where they land, they will land somewhere and find a way to continue their career in some form or another. So, I mean, I think not like when people say this is purely a complaint of the powerful, or this is a tool for, for justice for the powerless. I think in a lot of ways, I think your point is exactly right, that it's exactly wrong, that people have, that it's something that's really effective against powerless, somewhat anonymous people, but it's pretty ineffective against anybody, and oftentimes the way we talk about power is like a little all over the place. Like it's, what power means or doesn't mean on Twitter is often very unclear, at least to me. But yeah, anybody with anything that I think we would normally recognize as power, it's just gonna be vastly less effective against.
One thing I've been thinking about the more we kind of parse out where a lot of this stuff goes, there's other things that you talk about in your book, and in fact, our mutual friend Pascal Robert yelled at you about some of them.
He did,
yeah. So, what are the other issues that you think plague left-wing culture that you find to be, let's just say, maladaptive in their sociality? I'll use the term of art.
I got you. Yeah, I think Pascal was not entirely wrong. And it's kind of funny actually, because if you his affect is very different from mine, but I think if you read carefully sometimes the stuff that gets me in trouble for being a Menshevik at Zero Books, I don't think Pascal is actually that different from. But anyway, putting that aside,
I mean, you are a Menshevik, but like
sure, but so is he. But yeah, I mean, I don't think he's entirely wrong, because I think that I think there's like a core of what he was saying under this revolution discussion that I agree with. And, I don't know, I hope this was a little bit more clarified in the post-game discussion, that it would be ridiculous to claim that anybody on the contemporary American left, to the extent that such a thing even exists. And, I do kind of take the, there are forms of this point that I like a lot better than other ways of presenting it. But I mean, I think there is a sense in which, I think like the Adolf Reed formulation about how we have something that, maybe if everything goes just right in retrospect, there'll be a time when we'll be able to say, oh yeah, that was the left. But to the extent that such a thing even exists, because we're in such a dismal place in terms of, working class organization and real social weight, clearly nobody on it has a worked out roadmap to how we're going to win, or not just win in terms of smashing capitalism and instituting workers' control of the means of production and all that stuff, but even like much more modest goals along the way. And I think that's totally true, and I certainly hope that nothing I said in the book implied that I thought that we did. But I guess some of the stuff that Pascal's inclined to read as sectarianism, I would think of, I don't know, it's a cheesy metaphor, but like, I don't know exactly what the roadmap is, but I'm pretty sure that road there leads to a giant open hole in the middle of the street. And so does that one over there. And so I think we can, warn each other off of those without claiming that we know exactly which streets we should take. And so I think that I am very, very critical of both, what Fisher calls in the Vampire Castle essay, neo-anarchists, by which he means not just or even primarily or people who would actually call themselves anarchists, but certain kinds of anarchisty attitudes that become very common on broader swathes of the left. So he gives the example of saying that, it's like people who sort of rejected as reformist to want to like elect like a labor government to institute new social programs, but somehow it's totally fine to do like protests, to do like street protest movements against cuts to existing programs. And it seems a little incoherent. And I think that there are versions of that on the American left. I mean, you kind of referred to the abolitionism discussion. I'm very resistant to slogans of that kind. Part of this is maybe because of what you diagnosed a year or two ago as my engineer brain.
Yeah.
That I get very itchy when I hear people saying things that sound very radical, but also sound incredibly vague. And I'm sure this impulse could be taken too far and end up being used as a reason to dismiss necessary forms of radical rupture with the status quo that we can't possibly be expected to know every detail of in advance. But I kind of think that the radical left tends to err in the opposite way, that, we're way too willing to accept things that we like the sound of without actually asking follow-up questions about how they would work. What exactly does that mean in practice? If you okay, I mean, are prisons bad? Do I dislike them? Yes and yes. Do I think that the United States is has a massive problem with mass incarceration, that it's disgusting, that the form of imprisonment we have right now is barbaric? I mean, all of those things, yes. But if somebody says they want to abolish prisons, then I have some issues with that, both in terms of what that actually means. I think that there's been a lot of semantic drift on what that word abolish means, but then also on okay, if we are literally going to have a society at some point in the future that doesn't have prisons at all, then either you think that in this society, interpersonal violence will have withered away along with the state, or there's some other way that we're going to handle that that doesn't involve any form of imprisonment, and I hope it's not decentralized community death penalty as the alternative, because that's one thing that I actually am an abolitionist about. And also, by the way, I would add that that term abolish, I think there's some implicit analogy to abolitionism in the 19th century. And I would just point out that moderate anti-slavery politicians who hope to gradually squeeze out the institution over time were not generally referred to as abolitionists. Abolitionists meant people who wanted to abolish it now, overnight, which in my experience, a lot of people who call themselves abolitionists get slightly offended if you say that that's what they advocate. And they say, no, of course I don't want that. That would be ridiculous. I want to have it be, I want to either have a form of involuntary confinement that would be so different from what we call prisons now that it would be unrecognizable, no follow-up questions, or I want to gradually change society in ways that will diminish more and more the need for imprisonment, which just, I mean, I think if anybody said similar sentences about slavery, they wouldn't be called an abolitionist. And again, I just want to know a lot more details about how this would work before I'm willing to accept it. And all of those, granted, everything I just said is presented at a level that's a little bit sideways to the point of the book, because all of this stuff is sort of intra-left, very it's at a level of discussion that's slightly different than what I'm primarily worried about. But I think it connects, because I think if you want to convince the people that we would have to convince that we want to abolish police, we want to abolish prisons, etc., 99% of the time, the response is going to be, wait, what? Right? Because people think that you're saying that you want there to be no means of enforcing, laws, and that everybody who's currently in prison, even if they're there for rape or murder, is going to be let out tomorrow. And I think it is a problem when people are at best hopelessly vague in how they respond to these worries. And I guess my bigger concern is that it seems to me that, not in every case, I think in some cases people will say these things because they've really thought about it, and this is really the right view from their perspective. And you could say the same thing too with my criticism of Tankies, that there are people who have, there are people I respect who have sort of nuanced defenses of to a point or whatever defenses of what used to be called actually existing socialism, who like I think that it's just they've really deeply thought about it and they've come to a different conclusion than I have. But I think a lot of times with this kind of like neo-anarchisty politics and also with tanky politics in the modern left, I suspect that that's not really what's going on. My suspicion is that what's going on is that the left has been really distant from the levers of real world power for an incredibly long time. That like even like moderate social democracy has been totally off the table, much less anything more radical than that. We're both old enough that we can remember what politics were like in like the late '90s, and it was dismal. I mean, there was no way really to have a position to the left of liberalism and not be completely on the sidelines of real world politics. And under those circumstances, I think it's very easy to start in practice, at least, to think of left politics less as a concrete project to change the world and more as a symbolic performance of moral commitment. And if you and the most radical sounding way of doing that oftentimes scratches that itch better. That feels like a much purer moral stand against the many very real injustices that surround us, even though oftentimes I think that stuff is incredibly alienating to most of the people that we that we would need to reach. Oftentimes, in fact, I think that the point is that it's incredibly alienating to a lot of the people that we would want to reach, because if you're not pissing off enough people, or if enough people don't think you're crazy for what you're saying, then you don't feel like you've taken a sufficiently like rigorous and radical stand. I mean, that to my mind ties together what I was arguing about with Pascal about. It ties together also some of the features of the left that I think make us particularly vulnerable to cancel culture. Because if you're just engaged in a symbolic moral stand, then you're not really worried in practice about trying to win. I think it's very tempting to let that spill over into spending all of your time investigating the contents of other people's souls and seeing if they're taking like a properly rigorous stand, or if they're really taking the stand that they say they will, and to spend your time guarding the clubhouse rather than trying to expand it.
I think we have to.
Also, I just want to really quickly say it. I see somebody in the chat saying that there's on YouTube somewhere we could see Pascal and Harvey K yelling at each other about the New Deal. I really want to see that.
Yeah, I take Pascal's side on that.
Yeah,
but of course I do. I think my response to this is just that we need a very broad way of approaching the left, because I mean, Ben, some of what you're saying would apply to Marx and Engels themselves, like even though they would have never have opposed. I mean, Marx explicitly didn't oppose reformist actions that helped the working class or any kind of oppressed people, particularly in the latter half of his life. That's a big theme after the 1850s. But he also did argue that we needed to forcibly overthrow everything that currently existed. So, like, I sort of take a path where these MLs, and various other kinds of tankies. I mean, there's all kinds of people who have a weird fetish for authoritarian mid-century rolling in the tanks into Hungary for some reason. But and these neo-anarchist tendencies, I mean, if we're honest, we see them. We even see them in social. There's people who use ultra in a way that's also just as wild and moralistic. And so to me, you have to have a broad tent, and there has to be a way to keep people in this tent while also being honest about your disagreements with them. Like you and I often joke that like we're born at the same time. We've lived in some of the same places, even like multiple times. We have similar degrees. And if you were to take our stances on Facebook through the years, you would think I was the left anti-you. Yet we get along fine. You know, we can have this conversation. And why is that so hard for people to do? I mean, there are people that you would defend and I wouldn't. There are people I would defend that you wouldn't. But why is that such a hard place to get these various factions? I think it's factionated across the board, because I have seen increasingly like people throwing ultra around as like anyone critiquing like sort of the DSA national platform is now an ultra leftist. And I'm like, well, that historically meant something. And like I've seen it thrown at MMTers for whatever you feel about them. That's weird. So what do you make of that? What do you make of that tendency? Because I think you're right that it's not really about well thought out ideological or or geopolitical or political economic beliefs. Like
yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that I think that some of it at least comes out of a sort of specifically socialist version of what we were talking about earlier about the retreat into symbolism and having a sense that you have some sort of power over something, which is that if you can't, I remember Adam Proctor had an essay about this in 2017, I want to say, called, or it was like a blog post, and it was called Winning Before You Win, that I thought was insightful at the time. I think that he has that, we have a tendency to think like, okay, if I'm at least winning something somewhere, right, then like that feels real, even when it's not, right? Like, in other words, I think that if you can't like crudely, if you can't change the world, you can at least take over your 200 member socialist organization and bend it to your will, and that feels like you've accomplished something. And I think it's also, so I think that's part of the answer. I also think that part of the answer is just that it's really, really hard to actually be a consistent materialist. And I think I want to be careful about that, because I think that there's I think you can also OD on materialism, like, and sort of deny,
any
that,
agency whatsoever in any possible future other than what is.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And that's silly. But like, it's also, but I think even having, like a sort of what, the correct amount of materialism in your analysis, where, you don't deny that like which ideas are in people's heads has any sort of influence over anything ever, because
Hello? Are we both frozen, or it's just been frozen? Hopefully Ben rejoins us. Let's My dog isn't down here today. Otherwise, I would. I record in the base.
Okay. Yeah.
So you stop mid sentence.
Yeah, my dog accidentally dislodged the plug on my computer, so I switched to the laptop, which is why the audio is probably not as good right now. But yeah, I think that. But I think that with all those caveats that we talked about out of the way, it's still like really hard to be a materialist and to really like not think that that everything hinges on everybody having exactly the correct ideas in their heads, and that this is the sort of thing of the utmost moral importance in the world. Like lots of people who are officially committed to believing that to believing that what happens politically is a function of material forces and relations and all of that stuff, still kind of get really sucked into thinking that the most important thing in the world is whether people have exactly the right ideas and even exactly the right feelings, because a lot of this stuff ends up being not even about ideas, at least, which would actually be better, but just about attitudes. Like if you you like or have a positive attitude towards this person who said this, and so I see him as an enemy, and now by transitivity, I see you as an enemy. I see a lot of that all the time, right? I mean, like that there are I'm not going to inflame the chat by naming the specific figures, but I mean, like I'll get people who seem to spend a lot of their online lives sort of giving anybody grief who has too positive of an attitude towards certain figures who they obsessively hate, and they think that they're doing politics when they do that. And I think a lot of this stuff is about signaling that, like when you're talking about people who are really like, basically just expansive left social democrats who believe in MMT being accused of ultra leftism, like sometimes that's just carelessness that, I mean, whatever. I mean, this is, we can't get into this, or I'm going to sound like way too much of a grumpy old man. But I increasingly spend way too much time being angry about the fact that no one reads anything longer than a tweet or a headline, and so oftentimes it's just sort of vague impressions that somebody says something that uses just the right trigger words and sounds like something that a political enemy of a certain kind would say, and that's kind of good enough to decide that they are an enemy of that kind. I mean, like, my God, I mean, at least we've gotten into some very long arguments in the past, but like, at least what I actually think, and when you get mad at me, it's generally because of stuff that I actually do believe. There are people who pay so little attention that when they've gotten mad at me, they've accused me of being like a tanky.
Yeah, I've been accused of being a tanky, which is kind of hilarious. But one thing I will say about the left, and sometimes I do think some of this comes from the kind of left you end up dealing with when you're in the media sphere versus the kind of left you end up dealing with when you're doing political organizing work versus the kind of left you end up dealing with when you're doing activist work. And those three groups are actually, they all have similar weird, I don't want to sound like I'm romanticizing the non-online versions, because I work with activist stuff. I've done political work. They're very different than the online left. They have their own pathologies. And sometimes they overlap. I mean, I've had friends get sucked into groups that I thought were literally an online phenomenon that were just like basically an online. It turns out, no, they exist in the real world, and I found them. And they are almost as toxic in real life if they are are on the internet. But in general, the social dynamics are different, and the social reward system are different. The incentive system is different. I think I was talking last night about how Twitter, because of its character limit, because of its virality, and because the way people are primed to handle unique takes, tends to generate irony poisoning, to the point where I can't tell what people actually even believe, but some of what they're saying is ridiculous. And it's broadly tolerated by the left. And then there's people who say things that I think are not ridiculous that is instantly condemned. And then there's people who I think have learned to carve out a niche by constantly keeping specific kinds of leftists angry at them as a form of grift. And when I tell people that the old 20-year-old advice of don't feed the trolls would prevent these people from having a career, they still can't. They can't stop engaging. Like,
no, that's true, and whatever. I mean, I know that I've been very guilty of that sometimes, because oftentimes the reason that some of these people are so good at it, I mean, is that they have a talent for getting under your skin in exactly the right way to get you to engage with them on Twitter, which is the whole point. So, yeah, I mean, there definitely is that last kind of person definitely exists. I mean, that's to quote Adam again. That's I really like his formulation about how there are people who set up shop in the basement of the vampire castle, and maybe tell themselves or tell others that they're fighting vampires, but my God, they do all of the exact same things. It's structurally indistinguishable. They just have different enemies, and I think, yeah, in the I think. Sorry, I lost the thread there, but I think that this is like, as far as the issue of online versus IRL, I think it's a little bit tricky, because there is definitely a germ of truth there, that there are people who do like really useful organizing work in the real world, who are never on Twitter because they don't have time, or because they instinctively and correctly reject it, and who would never act that way because they know it would be counterproductive. Those people totally exist. That said, I think that we tend to be a little bit too eager to say, oh, this is just Twitter, this is just online, none of this counts, because I think even like IRL movements are not mostly made up of people I just said, right? I mean, those are the sort of Stocknovites in those movements who maybe do certainly a massively disproportionate amount of the useful work that's done there. But they're not most of the people. I mean, like, most of, if you go to like a DSA meeting or something, most of those people like have Twitter accounts.
Yeah.
And I think that one problem I have with being a little bit too eager to dismiss it as purely a phenomenon of Twitter is that realistically, in 2021, a tremendous amount of political interaction and political education and discussion, and even some of the opening phases of organizing. At some point, you have to log off and knock on doors, but people meeting each other, all that stuff, does happen online. And also, because in most cases, not every case, but in most cases, well, I don't want to say in most cases they're the same people, because that suggests that most people who talk about politics on Twitter are engaged in anything in real life, which would be false. But the other way around, I think, is true. Most people who engage in real life politics are also on Twitter, and the stuff like the political attitudes they form, the way that they think about the world, the way that they think about different factions of the left, that is formed on Twitter doesn't go away when they go to a meeting or they go to a protest or they get involved in electoral activity or union activity, or any of that stuff, right? So I think that, I mean, it's as tempting as it is to just sort of say that just log off, don't deal with this nightmare website, which, I mean, to be fair, I do think is the correct advice for like almost everybody. Like if you're like a writer or a podcaster or something, you probably have to, but otherwise it's the right advice for everybody. But I think that just treating it as an unserious distraction isn't totally defensible in a world where it just plays the role that it actually does in practice.
I would mostly agree with you, with the slight caveat that social dynamics, while as informed as they are by Twitter and ideology, what you like, we call, I used to call it like the ideological pinball machine, because you would see someone get radicalized, get onto Twitter, and the kind of radical they were would, one week they'd be a Maoist, the next week they'd be an anarchist, the week after that they'd be some kind of Hojist, then they'd discover Bordiga, then they'd like recant on that and found Kautsky, then they'd somehow start taking really weird positions like defending LaSalle.
Mm-hmm.
And you'd have met these people in person and they were originally doing something in real life, and the interaction of that kind of both overly broad and hyper shallow thought world with real life social dynamics is weird. And and weird is not a very descriptive term, but it really is very strange to figure out what the parameters are. But the kinds of things you use to bring people in and to redo socialization with a group, you want to talk, what people talk about, like real, I know this is, a lot of people say this is liberal language, but this is like, if you want to avoid constantly purging people, you do need rehabilitative practices and whatnot. I don't see any of those being even possible with the social, with the way online is socially set up. Mm-hmm. Like the kinds of things you would need to do, you can't prove except in a performative way, and the performative way itself would undermine it. So like it's set up to breed suspicion in a way that, like, if you're actually in a union or a DSA chapter or whatever, is very different. I will say also, in my experience with unions, they are less online because they're older.
Yeah, there's a lot of that too. Yeah, but even there, at least in mine, which granted, my recent experience with organized labor is mostly in an academic context where I could believe that it's a little bit different, but even there, I think the younger people who are involved are still fairly online.
Yeah, I don't teach any student who isn't fairly online unless they have very, very weirdly religious parents. So, I teach high schoolers, so I mean that's the wave of the future. Or maybe it's the wave of the past. Even they're online in ways we don't even understand, because they don't tend to be on Twitter. They tend to be on TikTok, and political TikTok blows my mind. But
I sort of vaguely know that it exists, but that's about what I could say about that.
Yeah, I mean, like it's like I can't imagine trying to do like what we do in like 30-second chunklets, verbally. It's hard enough on a tweet. So
can't even get through a whole sea shanty. I don't know. I mean, it's also, I'll grant you that I think political YouTube probably makes people a little self-indulgent, because we can talk and talk and talk. Like it doesn't, like there is something. I remember talking to Cale Brooks, the YouTube producer from Jacobin, about this, where he says he thinks about the fact that like on the shows they do there, what counts as like a segment is like, I mean, like if he was watching like Jon Stewart in 2005 or whatever, that would be the whole show.
Yeah. Yeah, it's something I think about a lot, though, because this is something you don't talk about, but I happen to know from education, is executive function decline is a universal problem in the developed world. And for people who don't know what that is, it means you have a shorter and shorter attention span. That's why many people can't naturally read a book, even though they're completely literate. So it's not a literacy problem. It is, I can't focus for long enough to get through a long chapter. If it's not in like 3-page chunklets, I die. And if you think I'm exaggerating, there's actually study after study after study on this. This is not just common amongst young people, that older people who used to be able to do this, who have constant engagement with screens, both online and with television, suffer the same problems. So it's not like kids these days, you know, that's like,
yeah, I don't know. I mean, do we have to just like, I mean, maybe, you know, like maybe we've just gotten to a point where we have to be like really effective Luddites to have, to be effective socialists, that we have to somehow have like a terrorist campaign to wipe out the internet. And then like, once that's done, you know, we can go back to organizing in ways that are more conducive to the left.
Marxism with Zerzan characteristics.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I hope not, because if that's true, we're doubly and triply doomed. We're more doomed than normal. Right. I mean, in another way, though, to flip this on the head a little bit, I also can't imagine the rebirth of discussions around social democracy, Marxism, and the various Marxist tendencies without the internet. Because you and I grew up, you know, I was a weirdo paleocon and you were a weirdo trot. But at a time where like you actually had to work to get in those circles, and the internet was a thing, and it was still hard. Like I have students who will pick up from Twitter and start reading Stalin, which is not something I'm always super excited about, but they do it.
At least they're reading.
Yeah, and they're reading, and you know, and who knows, they might be in Red Brigade's Austin in a few years. But they pick something up. So like I can't, with the negative we sound about the technology, I can't say that that's the primary or only problem, because we're also kind of weirdly dependent on it, not just as like media figures, but like a lot of the ideologies, the popularization of the problems, the fact that we don't really have an awareness problem anymore is the result of the very thing that's also making what we do hard. So yeah, I guess there's not really a question. It's just like it's just like that. It's almost, to use a phrase that is often abused on the left, the dialectical tension that I don't really have a way out of.
No, I think that's fair, and I'm not going to pretend that I have a way out either. I mean, in general, I'm in a slightly weird position with a lot of this stuff, because it's like I don't know entirely, right, what the answers are, mostly even, you know, what the answers are in terms of how the left can successfully resist some of these problems. But I also feel like, for the most part, the discussion is happening at a much earlier stage, that it's about people on the left not realizing that these things are problems. And so if I could at least sort of convince a lot of people that this is bad, and that we need to find a way to not act like this, and it's destructive and counter solidaristic, then maybe, you know, we can maybe we can come up with a like find ways of operating together that would solve it. But also, you know, I don't want to be too Panglossian about that, because, you know, the sort of germ of truth and the dark little joke about you know, having to you know, do socialism with, you know, Zerzan characteristics is you know, is that it is I think in some ways it's an unprecedented challenge, that there are lots of things about what the culture in general was like in 1936 that would infiltrate into, you know, whatever, like the Communist Party USA in 1936, and they'd have to have ways of dealing with and countering. but they could at least do that in in-person settings. That if in terms of things that were coming in from the larger culture that are bad for building solidarity, chauvinism and all that stuff. At the very least, there could be, and I'm not saying that that the ways of dealing with these things and the CPUSA, in that example, are like ideal ways, but like at least they could navigate those problems in person with a level of organization where there were like specific people who were empowered to deal with things and to make decisions. Whereas to the extent that we are stuck with having a lot of politics taking place online, which I think we are. I mean, like we just got through an entire year where you couldn't actually do any in-person politics without taking severe health risks, and then it's just a much harder problem because we're navigating this in territory that is innately worse for us, and I'm not prepared to say that there is no solution, because I think that that's premature, and because I think that if the payoff to having a more effective left is enough that it's worth sort of it's worth holding out hope, but it's certainly like it's at the very least it's a different kind of challenge than like past versions of the left had to face.
Yeah. Although I will also say we don't shoot each other nearly as much, so there's that. And on that note, I guess we've talked. I think we kind of wrung this out for a little bit, and I would like to anything you need to plug or
sure. Yeah. So the book we've been talking about is Canceling Comedians While the World Burns. If you want to buy that from worker-owned bookstore, go to redemmas.org. Everything else I do you can find at benburgis.com, and the show Give Them an Argument is the main show, at least, is Monday nights at 8 Eastern. Tonight our friend Ben Udashin is going to be on, and in fact, I'm really glad we're doing this tonight because this conversation has kind of depressed me, and this will be some good relief from that.
Right.
We're going to go through Mike Huckabee's booklet, The Kid's Guide to Fighting Socialism. So that's tonight at 8.
All right. Well, that'll be fun. All right. So I got to do my patron announcements, and we have 3 new patrons here: Mask of the Red Death, Sungjin Chung, and Daniel Weed at the officer level of it. I'd like to thank you guys. We're almost at 100 patrons already. So thank you for supporting me. Like and subscribe, share and share alike. And if you can't patronize me, I actually, what I need more is for you guys to share this stuff and get it out there. I do this for educational purposes. The more people see it, the better it'll be. So, their audio versions of these are available at Buzzsprout/Varn blog voice. You can find the Patreon at Patreon/Varn blog. That's VARNVLOG. For patrons, there will be in about an hour a conversation and after show with Erica, and we're gonna be talking about medieval history and probably responding to this interview. And some people can get mad at me for who I chat. I actually kind of feel when we talk about these subjects, I get mad at everybody. because I feel like, frankly, we get two opposed camps. One that is a saying that there's no reason to socially shun people, which there are reasons to socially shun people. I just think there is concept drift that is about interpersonal power. That really hurts things. Also, Chris Hedges' stance on the black bloc was bad. His moralizing in general makes me angry. Although he's changed some of those stances, he took some very, very conservative positions during Occupy, of all things. So yeah, he only recently started calling himself a socialist. By the way, he fought that label tooth and nail till at least the middle of the last decade. I've been following Chris Hedges since I was a paleo-conservative because he was popular in paleo-conservative circles because of his anti-war writing, which is actually quite good, I may add. So showing up afterwards today. And yeah, maybe we'll talk about Chris Hedges some of the extra. I don't know. Read his early stuff. Wars of Forces gives us meaning. And if you want to see why I get mad at him, read the books that are basically Jeremiads about consumer culture from the late aughts after Bush is gone. They make me mad. His current stuff, and listen to his slagging off on the black bloc and making it sound like the police were right to arrest him, which I thought was ridiculous. Because, people have charged, whatever you think of black bloc as a tactic, people have charged them with absurdly inflated charges. Yeah. Oh, his book on the New Atheist is kind of fun. That's the problem, though. There's this whole he's not a revolutionary, but a great journalist. With Hedges, he's trying to run a party eventually, kind of a new version of what was done with the Green Party in America. I think it's the People's Party. So it's hard for me to say he's not a politician at this point. He's not a revolutionary, sure, but like most people aren't. He does good writings on American social services. Anyway, I'm going to let you guys go. There's going to be an after show that's going to be more informal with Erica in about an hour. This week there's a lot coming up because I'm going to be on hiatus during the month of June for Patreons and for people subscribed to Varn Vlog Voice, which is the podcast form of this. There will be more material coming out, and soon, including a few things that are not available on this channel. But this channel, because I record it live, will not be recording during June. Every day, you guys make me want to, I don't know, scrub all your brains.